We have this image of America's founding fathers, right? This kind of united front, a real band of brothers. Well, that's pretty much a myth. The second the Revolutionary War was won, a new war started. This was a war of ideas, fought with blistering ink and massive ambition. And let me tell you, it was every bit as fierce as the one fought with muskets. So, let's dive into this battle for the very soul of America. And listen, this isn't some historian looking back hundreds of years later. This is George Washington himself, writing in 1792, and he is just deeply, deeply troubled by the toxic political atmosphere. He's watching his own cabinet, the people who were supposed to be the pillars of the new republic, basically trying to tear each other's throats out. His words tell you everything. This wasn't just some minor disagreement. This was a high-stakes, fundamental conflict that he feared could literally break the country apart. So at the very heart of all this chaos were two absolute titans, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, he was all about the need for an efficient general government, something strong enough to hold the Union together. But Jefferson, he looked at Hamilton's plans and saw a threat, a conspiracy, really, to destroy the present Republican form of government and, in his mind, replace it with something like a monarchy. These two completely opposite visions, well, they were the engine for every single major debate of that era. And their first huge battleground was all about power. Simple question, right? Who gets to hold the reins? Should it be a strong, centralized national government, or should the real power stay with the individual states? This question would absolutely define the first decade of the Republic. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't the Constitution settle all this? I mean, it laid out all the powers of the federal government. But nope, not even close. Far from ending the argument, the Constitution's ratification was really just the opening bell for round two. The fight over what it all meant started immediately. And here's where we get our first big twist, and it involves the father of the Constitution himself, James Madison. Before the Constitution was even ratified, his position? Well, it's probably not what you think. In a 1787 letter to Washington, he argued for an incredibly strong federal power. He wanted a federal veto over all state laws. He saw it as, quote, absolutely necessary to stop the Union from collapsing. But then, hold on, just 2 years later, that same James Madison is drafting the Bill of Rights. And look what he proposes for the 10th Amendment. It's a complete 180. He now enshrines the principle of states' rights, explicitly saying that any powers not given to the federal government belong to the states. I mean, talk about a seismic shift. And you can bet someone noticed this flip-flop. Big time. Alexander Hamilton. He complained bitterly about his former partner, pointing out that Madison, the guy who once saw the states as the real danger, had totally reversed course. Now, suddenly, Madison was taking every chance he could to sound the alarm about federal overreach. This change really marks the final break between them and seals Madison's new alliance with Thomas Jefferson. All right, so let's move on to the next major clash, which was just as divisive, the economy. The question here was really fundamental. What was America going to be? A simple republic of independent farmers? Or was it going to become a complex, centralized commercial and manufacturing powerhouse? The flashpoint for this whole debate was Hamilton's financial plan, especially something called his funding system. The basic idea was for the new federal government to take on all the massive debts the individual states had racked up during the war, lump them all together, and then issue new federal bonds to pay for it all. To Hamilton, this was a stroke of genius. To Jefferson, it was a complete disaster in the making. And Jefferson's critique was just scathing. He was convinced Hamilton's plan wasn't really about finance. He saw it as a political weapon. He argued that by getting members of the legislature to own these federal bonds, Hamilton was creating a corrupt squadron right inside Congress, a voting bloc that wouldn't be loyal to the people who elected them, but to the Secretary of the Treasury himself. Hamilton, of course, saw things completely differently. He argued his system was absolutely essential. It would bring order and vigor to the nation's totally chaotic finances. And, just as importantly, it would strengthen the national government by tying the interests of the wealthiest citizens directly to the success of the United States. And this table here, it just lays the core differences out bare, doesn't it? For Jefferson, the soul of the republic was the independent farmer. Debt was a moral danger. A national bank was totally unconstitutional and just helped the rich, and power needed to be decentralized with the states. For Hamilton, the future was all about commerce. Debt? That's a useful tool to build credit. A bank was absolutely necessary for financial order, and power had to be centralized to be effective. It was a choice between two completely, totally irreconcilable futures for the country. Now, this ideological war didn't just stop at America's borders. The debate over foreign policy, whether to side with revolutionary France or with the old enemy, Great Britain, it got intensely personal. And it was just filled with nasty insults. And this is where the attacks got so personal. Hamilton didn't just disagree with Jefferson's policy, he went right for his character. He dismissed his pro-French stance as emotional and irrational, a womanish attachment. This wasn't a policy debate anymore. This was a direct insult, designed to paint his rivals as weak, hysterical, and not fit to lead. Jefferson hit back just as hard. He basically painted Hamilton as a secret agent for the British, accusing him of using his cabals, his little secret groups, in Congress to force a pro-British agenda on the country, against its own honor and interest. The accusation was crystal clear. Hamilton wasn't just wrong, he was disloyal, a puppeteer working for a foreign power. So after all this venom, all this division, how did it all end? Well, the truth is, it didn't. The rivalry really outlived the men themselves, and their battles basically set the stage for the political fights we're still having today. The whole conflict reached a fever pitch in the election of 1800. It was an incredibly bitter, nasty campaign that pitted Jefferson against Hamilton's party, which was led by President John Adams. When Jefferson finally won, he didn't just see it as an election victory. He called it a second American Revolution, a peaceful transfer of power that, in his view, saved the Republic from the Federalists' monarchical schemes. And yet, in his very first speech as president, Jefferson does something remarkable. He strikes this incredible tone of reconciliation. After one of the ugliest elections in history, he gets up there and declares, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He was making a desperate plea for unity, trying to argue that, hey, despite our party labels, we're all Americans bound by the same core principles. But one nice speech couldn't just erase a decade of really deep, bitter conflict. Those underlying tensions, they stuck around for years. Washington's plea way back in '92 went totally ignored. Jefferson's call for unity in 1801 was more of a hope than a reality. And even a decade after that, the guys who built these systems were still grappling with what they had done. And maybe the most telling point comes from this letter, written years later by an elderly John Adams to his old rival Thomas Jefferson. After all the fighting, after their presidencies were long over, Adams admits that their fundamental disagreements were still there. He basically says, look, we both did what we thought was best. Only time, only posterity will tell who was actually right. The founders themselves knew the debate was far from over. Which, of course, leaves us with this final question. When we argue today about the size of government, about national debt, about America's place in the world, are we really just having the same exact debate that Hamilton and Jefferson started all those years ago? It really seems like the cords they strained over 2 centuries ago are still just as tight today.